coming in, but I would like not to use up all of our speakers' time. And so let's go ahead and begin with our introductions of the persons who are participating in the program tonight, and that way we will save some time for them. As you know, the format for these lectures is after our speaker gives his address, we will have a respondent both from the Jewish community and from the Christian community, and following the responses it will be thrown open for question and answer. And I encourage you to make note of questions that you would wish to ask as we progress through this, and please feel free to ask the questions that you may have. We're doing one thing slightly different this year, namely the reception that we have following the lecture, instead of being in another location, is going to be, as would be obvious, here in this room. And that will enable us to continue discussion more quickly and hopefully not lose people from one point to the next, and you will be able to stay and enjoy the discussion for as long as you can. Now may I introduce our two respondents for tonight. I appreciate very much their willingness to participate in our program. First of all, we have Rabbi Lawrence A. Schlessinger. Larry Schlessinger, who has been here in the city only for a short time at this point, came here in 1993 as associate rabbi at Congregation Beth Ahava. Prior to his coming here, Larry has his baccalaureate degree from the George Washington University in D.C., and he is a native of D.C. He has his M.A. in Hebrew Letters from Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York City, from which he also has his rabbinical ordination. Prior to coming to Beth Ahava, Larry has served congregations in Portsmouth, in Syracuse, New York, and in Columbus, Georgia. And interestingly, and not atypically, in both Syracuse and in LaGrange, Georgia, which was near where he was in Columbus, he did some part-time teaching in academic institutions there. He is finding his way into this community very quickly. Now, I will not bother to read involvements here in the city, but already he is beginning to be quite involved. Larry, we appreciate very much your help. And for the responding for the Christian community, Robert Trache. I have known Bob Trache for a number of years now and have grown to respect him and his work. He too is very new to the city. He is at St. James Episcopal Church, the rector of St. James Episcopal Church, and those of you who have noticed the newspapers, he came here under difficult circumstance with the fire at St. James. Bob and Larry share something at this point. They both share alma mater at George Washington University. Bob has both his BA and his MA from George Washington University, and then he went on to Harvard Divinity School, where he took his MDiv. He has a very interesting background. While he was still in college, he worked as a research associate with the offices of United States Senator Jacob Javits, which tells us a whole lot about you right from that point. He has served in academic institutions in the area of admissions, financial aid, things of this nature. He has taught part-time at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, and this is while he was serving as an assistant rector at St. John's Church in Wilmington, North Carolina. He also served in Sudbury, Massachusetts, and for 11 years prior to coming to Richmond, he was at Emmanuel Church on the Hill in Alexandria, a very active and vital parish there. And it was there that I knew of Bob's work in particular. So, Bob, we appreciate your help on this as well. For our speaker for this evening, it is a distinct pleasure for me to introduce to you someone that I know many of you already know, because Walter Harrelson is an individual who has been in the city of Richmond and to the university on several occasions, and you would know him in other places as well, I am sure. At this point, Dr. Harrelson is serving as university professor at Wake Forest University. Wake Forest is in the beginning process of establishing a divinity school at the university. And as they looked around for a person to serve as an advisor consultant as they moved through that process, they obviously found one of the best persons that they could possibly find for that in Walter Harrelson. So he began a 2-year appointment as university professor at Wake Forest in July, and this will continue for 2 years, and he can take, as he says, all the credit for the good things that happens. If it doesn't work out, obviously they didn't follow his advice. It's a nice thing about a short appointment. Dr. Harrelson is a native of North Carolina, so he's, in a sense, he's coming home when he goes to Wake Forest. He began his academic work at Mars Hill College. Following his work there, he went into the United States Navy and was in that capacity for 4 years. Coming out of the Navy, he then went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and completed his baccalaureate work there. Following that, he went to Union Theological Seminary in New York and took his basic theological degree and the Doctor of Theology degree there. Now, from that point onward, Dr. Harrelson's work has been exclusively in theological education. He went to Andover Newton for a period of approximately 5 years. He went then to the University of Chicago, where he was dean of the divinity school there. And then for 30 years, he served at Vanderbilt University. For a period there of 7 or 8 years, he was dean of the divinity school there. He is a scholar of the Hebrew Scriptures. He has given a great deal of himself to the issues associated with Jewish-Christian relations. His writings have been in both of those areas. Just to mention a couple, Interpreting the Old Testament, a very excellent textbook that he wrote, From Fertility Cult to Worship, a kind of sociological study, as I would see it, of what happens in the worship of Israel, The Ten Commandments and Human Rights, and then one of his more recent books, and Walter, one that I've used with a class here, Jews and Christians, A Troubled Family, a book that he co-wrote with a Jewish rabbi in Nashville while he was still there. His most recent writing is entitled The Making of the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which comes out of an appointment that he had serving as the vice chair of the committee that produced the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. This was a work that exceeded anyone's expectations in terms of the involvement and the work that they had, but they have come out with an excellent product, and one that all of us can be grateful for what they have done. He is married to Adela Harrelson. Unfortunately, she could not be with us on this trip. They have 3 children, And when you talk to Walter and ask anything about the children, you know a proud parent. Walter, we are extremely happy to have you with us tonight. He is going to speak to us on the subject of Christian readings and misreadings of the Hebrew Scriptures, which to me is a fascinating topic. Walter?
Thank you very much, Frank, and thanks to all of you for coming on a night that started out pretty stormy, at least where I was. I'm very, very grateful to the Weinsteins and the Rosenthals, their family, to the president, to colleagues of long standing on this university religion faculty. I think of Jack Taylor when I'm here, who was for many years in physics at Richmond and was with me in a little country high school. We began together as grammar school students in the 4th grade when the school opened, and in 1935 he and I were graduated from that high school. There were 23 or 4 or 5 of us, and his career brought him here in physics, and mine, after 5 years of doing other things, led me to college and on. And I haven't seen Jack yet, but I do hope to see him. If I don't, I hope those of you who know him will express my greetings to him. I know he's had tragedy in his family, and I'm deeply touched by hearing about that. Now, this topic for tonight is a pretty limited one, but it's big enough. There are many things that one could be talking about. One could be talking about elements in the Hebrew Scriptures that we all have to reject. Now, it's very important, candidly, I think, to say that there are sayings in this glorious body of literature that are outrageously wrong. And that's not our subject for tonight, but just in case any of you don't know that I think that, I want to let you know that I do. Now, how do you handle outrageously wrong things in the Scripture that is so dear to your heart? The way that I have found thus far to try to do that is to say there are central features of the Scriptures of the Bible. And those central features enable one to see what is not so central. And how does one know what's central? One is led to these central features by deep engagement with the material itself and by good sense and divine interventions and all kinds of other ways, so that one is not simply choosing, picking what one likes and ignoring what one doesn't. But God did not say to the people at Baal Peor, kill all the Midianites, men, women, and children. I think we can say that here. Numbers 25 and Numbers 31 are just not on target. That's peripheral. But when the text says, God, gracious and loving, slow of anger, of great mercy, by no means acquitting the guilty, but showing mercy to the 1000th generation of those who fear God, that's central. And in that text, from Exodus 34, we actually have quotations of the text over and over and over again in the Hebrew Scriptures, in apocryphal literature, and it's also present behind texts in the New Testament. That's central. So one thing we could be talking about are those texts, and they cause difficulty, no doubt, in relations between Jews and Christians. They cause difficulty within the Jewish community. They cause difficulty within the Christian community. They cause difficulty as the Bible is employed by persons who are not religious but who find it of great and compelling insight and power. But that's just to indicate that we're now dealing with a more limited topic tonight. We want to take those ways of reading the Hebrew Scriptures by Christians that have caused difficulty usually honestly, not perversely, but have caused difficulty to the Christian community as it has studied what it calls the Old Testament. Reading interpretation is always tough. Yehuda ben Eli, whom I like to quote on such occasions, in the 3rd century of our era, said, "The one who translates literally lies. The one who adds anything to the text blasphemes." Those are our choices, to be a liar or a blasphemer. You can't do the one, you can't do the other, but you're certainly going to do both. So the first of these misreadings that I would call your attention is one of the great glories of the Hebrew Scriptures, the picture of God's bringing judgment upon a faithless human community, the people of the covenant. God's judgment shows up. God's judgment upon the first human pair. God's judgment upon Cain for his murder. God's judgment upon Lamech for bloodthirstiness. God's judgment upon the whole existent human race. Because, as the text says, every imagination of the thought of the human heart was only evil all the time. That's pretty bad. And the flood comes. Judgment on the people who make a tower. Judgment on Abraham for not quite telling the truth. Judgment on Moses for rashness, manslaughter, what one could call murder. Judgment on the people who turn away from God over and over again. While the covenant is being made atop Mount Sinai, the people are engaged in blasphemous acts at the foot of the mountain. Now, those judgments are, of course, theological judgments. But think how easy it would be, and indeed has been, for Christian Sunday school teachers to teach the children how awful those ancient Israelites were. They seemed never to get the point. They were always turning their back on God. They just couldn't be faithful to save their lives. Amos would speak excoriatingly against all of them and threaten their utter annihilation. Other prophets would do the same thing. They might have some words of promise and hope now and again, but on the whole, those earlier prophets were saying, God can hardly endure this people. And Christian teachers can, without intending that, simply help young people and people not so young to say they're not much better today. So you take a powerful indictment by the community of Israel itself against itself for its failings to be a covenant people, and you turn that into a flat assertion of the rightness of God's judgment upon a faithless people. We could talk a lot about that. I'll get back to it when I indicate what I think are, and this is the structure of my paper. I will secondly, after I get through these 3 points, I will go back and indicate ways in which they might have done this that would have been more satisfactory, ways in which Christians might have understood that. And then in the third place, I will take one particular set of texts and talk about them a little more in detail. So that's the plan for the evening. Don't relax, because I'm going to have to go fast. The second of the points, and this now is not a mistake made by Sunday school teachers. This is a mistake made by scholars. This is a mistake that has so characterized early on the Protestant approach to the Hebrew Scriptures, and eventually Roman Catholics got into the act as well, and Orthodox, so that it became a rather perennial Christian misreading. It's the question, what happened in Babylonian exile and what happened when the people returned from Babylonian exile. Now, the thesis was coined by the great biblical scholar Julius Wellhausen, who was a genius, who saw wonderfully the course of the development of Israelite religion on the basis of the available information, but he had this fix on the glories of prophetic literature, and he couldn't but believe that when the people went into Babylonian exile, their state that was intended to be now a corporate entity faithful in moral terms to the divine will and to the covenant began to disintegrate. And there in Babylonian exile, the law was developed. The law, Torah. For this great Lutheran thinker, the law was and had to be a kind of oppressive entity. And the community that worked on the law during this period of time was a community giving up much of the precious heritage of their ancestors. So Babylonian exile was a time of the encouragement of the law, of the development of Sabbath observance, of the development of synagogue, of teaching that was going to emphasize and sort of standardize the way by which the law was understood and applied. And then when the people returned from Babylonian exile, this Torah, which eventually Ezra brought a copy of, would become then that oppressive instrument of divine instruction and guidance that had to make the people Israel into a people of the book, of the law, of a narrow kind of perspective on religion. Now, put in the terms I've put it, no one today would accept that. No one. But the process of viewing the developing history of the people of Israel continues to be an influential thing in the way Christians think about the Hebrew Scriptures. And what one has to say is that it's awfully hard on a steady diet of a distinction that Paul draws between law, nomos, and divine love and grace, not to fall into that kind of trap when one looks at the development of Torah in ancient Israel. Now, people are so capable of looking the evidence in the face and not seeing it that they have done that regularly. The same scholars who make with Wellhausen this kind of an understanding of what's going wrong in the return from Babylonian exile are the people who have helped us best to know what was going on in the period after the return from Babylonian exile and the period of exile itself. Great, gifted scholars working on this Jewish literature, working on the history of the times, working archaeologically, working across the board, turning up one bit of evidence after another that this description of a post-exilic community was wrong. But that didn't change the general slogan. When the return from Babylonian exile was a time, as Zechariah says, of small things. A time when Judaism was in decline. A time when some of the things that the New Testament describes as characteristic of the religion of scribes and Pharisees was already being established. Now, there were, of course, elements of decline in the return from Babylonian exile. But there were also, in exile and on the return from exile, emphases, insights, new literature, fresh understandings of the most sweeping and glorious sort. These scholars were able to look those things in the face and decide that each of them, in turn, was an exception. Still, the case was that when the people came from Babylonian exile and reestablished a small temple and began to reorganize their lives, it was a time of small things. And the religious vitality had been stripped away. And Judaism was now, a kind of arid, sterile religion of the law. See how easy it is then, on that kind of a basis, for Christians to say, we Christians had to come along and save the day. So now we've got two misreadings of very serious sort. one where the judgments that the people of Israel in the name of God pronounce upon themselves are treated flatly and with banality and made into actual flat judgments describing the history of Israel, as though the Israelites were the worst people in the ancient Near Eastern world. Who can believe that? These are judgments upon people who no doubt have done wrong, but they certainly are not, factually and empirically, the worst people in the ancient Near Eastern world. That's not believable. So, and similarly, the people who return from Babylonian exile, who can speak, for example, of a day to come when God will establish a great highway connecting Egypt and Assyria. And God will say on that occasion, "Blessed be Egypt, my people. Blessed be Assyria, the work of my hands. Blessed be Israel, my heritage." Using key terms. And me, my people. Po'al yadai, the work of my hands. And the halti, my heritage. My heritage. And saying these things about Egypt, about Assyria, and about Israel, as though these people are all equal in the sight of God. Now, there are some Christian interpretations of that text from Isaiah 19 that go this way. What that text is saying is, proudly and arrogantly, that poor, puny little Israel is now claiming a place of great national prominence among Egypt and Assyria. How perverse an interpretation, when what the prophet is saying is just the opposite. That the hope of Israel for the last days is a hope when God will bring the human community into unity and will no longer ignore the divine promise to Israel, but will affirm the divine promise for Egypt and for Assyria. The third of these, in some ways the most serious of all, is the way in which Christians understand the texts that talk about the future of the people of Israel under God. Texts we call eschatological texts, texts that have to do with the end time, with the consummation of life on earth. These texts, of course, are claimed in the Christian community, in its liturgy, and have become a large part of the fabric of Christian hope and Christian faith. And in that regard, they have been given great prominence and a wonderful, secure place within Christian history, within Christian piety, and all of that's to the good. The difficulty has been that these texts have often been so understood as Christian texts that their import for the continuing Jewish community has been very hard to maintain. So, a text like Isaiah 2, which we'll come to in a little bit, is a text now that Christians have associated with the fulfilling of the divine work at the last day, and we have, understandably and with religious justification, associated that with the work of God in Jesus as the Christ. That's our religious faith. We certainly are entitled to affirm it. But I think that the difficulty has been that we have so interpreted these texts, especially the ones at Advent, in the cycle of readings that many churches observe. Even some Baptist churches know the lectionary these days. That we haven't remembered that these are also texts of the Jewish community with a continuing import and vitality of their own in that community. And so misreading the eschatological texts as Christian texts can underscore that most difficult problem the Christian community has faced through the years: how to affirm the newness of the work of God in Jesus and the sense of utter truth that Christians have about the revelation that comes there, without thereby saying that the faith of Israel has lost all religious meaning. It's so easy to say Christian faith takes over from Judaism. It takes over because of all of these misrepresentations I've tried to describe. The judgment of God on Israel, and now God's turn to us, Gentiles, the Christian community. The lack of vitality in the Judaism that preceded the appearance of Christianity, which made it all the more appropriate for God to turn to us Christians. And now these texts describing the future, which religiously we cannot but appropriate, and in appropriating have frequently not been able to find a way to affirm their continuing meaning for the Jewish community. Now let's hazard the view of how such misrepresentations might have been avoided. And I'll just pick up some of the things I've already said in a little further reach. Now, how the Jewish community understands these things, we Christians can hazard answers, but we better not be very definitive. What I think we can say is a possible Christian reading of those particular problems that does not appear anyway to encourage Christian misunderstanding of Judaism or Christian mistreatment of Jews. The judgment. The judgment theme comes in connection with the promise of God. The judgment falls upon the community Israel because God has said to Abraham, leave your land, your kinsfolk, go to a land that I will point out to you. There I will make your name great, and you are yourself to be a blessing. I think we ought to read that phrase, Veheya barakah, and you are to be a blessing. Not so that you may be a blessing, as we sometimes translate, but as an imperative, or a kind of imperative. And you be a blessing. And in you all the families of earth will find blessing. So that the promise of God that comes to Abraham and is repeated over and again is a promise on the way to fulfillment, fraught by the judgment that befalls the Jewish community, the Hebrew community, and the whole human community, because, as we've been told already in Genesis 3, the world that God has created good has gotten twisted. It's not a fallen world. I think the use of that kind of language is unfortunate. It's a distorted world. It's a world in which things are twisted, out of kilter. They're not quite the way God purposes that they be. And people live out their lives then in that kind of situation. And people go astray. And now and again people simply rear back and do wrong. And God's judgment falls. But it's a theological judgment that falls. It empirically, no doubt, does apply from time to time. That some of the people that Amos is talking about as having stolen from the poor people, and who simply insist on pushing people's head into the dust of the earth just because, by golly, they can. Those are descriptions of people who do mistreat other people, and we can be pretty sure that there were people mistreating other people that he's talking about. So it's not that there was no empirical evidence. It's just that we ought to be judicious in reading these judgments that befall the people Israel. And the worst thing, of course, for us to do is to say that these are judgments upon the people Israel as a people, rather than judgments upon evildoers within Israel. Now, the prophets talk in these corporate terms, but they're certainly not saying every Israelite equally and with deliberation has done these misdeeds. So, and certainly we can also follow I think the good rubric for all analysis of religious communities. We can try to be generous as Christians in the assessment of the religion of others. And we can hope that others will be generous in their assessment of us as religious people. So don't take the worst view. Take the best view, and if the evidence forces you to come to a different judgment, come to it. But don't start with it. So viewed in that light, I think it is possible for us to read the judgments as a great tribute to the religious commitments of the people of the covenant, or some among them anyway, who keep saying, God calls on us to be a faithful people in this world, and God's not really going to be satisfied with just ordinary run-of-the-mill faithfulness. God loves you, Israel. God cares for you. God's placed you where you are, and God lays upon you responsibility to be before the nations a light that they may see, to have therefore a character and a quality of life, religiously viewed, that is demanding of you, because so much depends on your faithfulness. The very health of the world depends upon your faithfulness. Now we have to be careful with that kind of theological understanding too, so that we don't again make that empirical and demand that every Jew be twice as good as anybody else because they are the people of the covenant. You know, we've sometimes fallen into that kind of a way of speaking about the state of Israel, I think, and demanded there a quality of political and social and economic life that really went beyond any reasonable expectation of a fallible political community in our kind of world. As for exile, I think there the problem is a great deal easier. The exile, we know, is a time, well, we don't absolutely know what we almost know, is a time when the following things took place. The Torah, the first 5 books of Scripture, were finally shaped. The Psalms were collected and edited, and many of them recast with some additions made. The former and the latter prophets were largely put together, edited, recast. The general body of literature that we call the sacred writings, a great deal of it was produced. Probably the book of Job was produced early in the period of Babylonian exile, probably in Judah, back in the homeland. This is a fantastic achievement of a people who have gone into exile, where one might very well expect that they would have been dispersed like those that left in the 8th century and disappeared from view. So the time of Babylonian exile was a time of extraordinary fertility of spirit and mind and imagination, in which much of the Jewish heritage was shaped and reshaped and prepared for its being brought back from Babylonian exile, when groups of exiles began to return in the 6th century, toward the end of the 6th century, and continued then in groups for another couple of centuries. What an extraordinary thing. As for Ezra, Ezra is a person I've worked on a lot, and I have great fondness for Ezra. And we do have the texts that say Ezra got the word that people had married foreign wives, and he just had to get rid of them. And so I've read that text over and over again, and 2 things comfort me. One is Ezra cried a lot when he heard this. He tore his garments. He was really sick to death that this should have happened. He cared about the character of Jewish life in that period of exile, and he wanted things not to be that way. And he didn't just sternly begin to drive people away. He wept and prayed all night. And when the people gathered the next day, somebody had the presence of mind to say to Ezra, why don't we let the leaders of the local communities settle this question? And it was agreed that that would happen. Now, almost certainly that means Ezra was glad to have this problem off his hands, but it almost surely meant that there was more tolerance and more thoughtfulness in the actual administration of the thing. And one other thing about this Ezra, for some reason, and I think it's a good one, Ezra was remembered later on as the champion of the law, but also as the friend of sinners. Now, this is now the person who brings the Torah back, this thing that's supposed to be, so hard and so unyielding and so religiously suffocating. He's remembered as the friend of sinners. Read the text, 2nd Esdras, and you have Ezra as the one who pleads with the angel for some alternative way to be found by God to offer pardon to sinful people, including sinful Israel. And Ezra pleads and goes over this and argues with God with great logic and power. Of course, the text comes out with the angel saying, don't you worry about those sinners. God's going to take care of them. And anyway, you just think about the many righteous whom God's going to spare and push the sinful people out of your mind. You know, the kind of thing that I think many a person in our own time seems to be able to do. That's one of the strangest things to my mind about a kind of fundamentalist Christianity, that it can be so utterly blasé about God's pending destruction of most of the human race. But not Ezra. Not Ezra. Ezra's not that kind. So I think we can say that this picture of exile and of return from exile is certainly a picture that does not fit. We know also that the literature of Jonah, in all likelihood Ruth, though some people think Ruth is older, were produced at this time, some say in reaction to the prophet Ezra. I wouldn't put it quite that way. I would say this is an alternative religious spirit of the time of the return from Babylonian exile. The text I quoted from Isaiah 19 comes from that period. In Zechariah chapter 2, there's a reference of people coming from many nations and lands into the community Israel and receiving God's blessing and intention for them. There's the story in chapter 8 of Zechariah of 10 persons seizing on the coat of every Jew and saying, we're going your way, we hear God's with you. Well, that's 10 to 1 outnumbering the Jews in this work of God at the end. These are extraordinary kinds of texts, open-hearted texts, texts describing the way by which the Gentiles find a place in the divine purpose. So it's simply not the case that we have a sterile Jewish community. We have a community with some narrow-mindedness. There are texts in the great Isaiah 40 through 55 that say the city of Jerusalem is going to be beautified and enriched at the expense of other nations, those nasty nations that treated us so badly. So I don't want now to baptize with glory every Jewish spokesperson from this period. Some of them were like us, pretty narrow-minded, and their perspectives were not what they ought to be. But the point is that there is a great deal of evidence in support of an alternative vision of this time of the return from Babylonian exile. Now, the last thing is to take just a couple of texts and describe how the promises of God in these great texts from the prophets might be understood in a way that would be valuable both for Jews and Christians, but also for Muslims, and I think we could say for any sensitive and thoughtful reader of this great literary heritage. You read Isaiah 2, a text we know so well. It appears also in Micah 4. This is from the New Revised Standard Version, which in the next text I'm going to have critical things to say about, myself and my colleagues, because I don't think we did it right. But this one I think is fine. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that God may teach us the divine ways, and that we may walk in God's paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. God shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, nor shall they learn war anymore. And then the transitional verse, verse 5 is, O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Now that text has had a long history, we all know. And the Christian community, as I said earlier, has certainly got a right to see in this promise of peace and blessedness for the earth that kind of peace and blessedness that does, in our experience, emerge in the work of God in Jesus as the Christ, and in the early Christian communities, and throughout the history of Christian faith. But it's also a text that's not just for us Christians. It's a text that's describing the coming of God's righteous, peaceful rule over the whole of the earth. The nations come and say to one another on the way, let's go to the place where Torah is being taught. Not to convert to Judaism, but to learn the ways of the God who has called the world into being and who governs that world and who sees to its purpose. That's the text that we have. And when we think now about the question, how do such texts likely function in a religious community already in the time when it was created, whenever that was? Many people, including me, are not at all sure that it comes from the prophet Isaiah in just this form, but it certainly comes fairly early in the work of these classical prophets. If it's not from the 8th century, then it's very likely from the 7th. It's early on in the process. I think that we can say that 4 things happen when a community has such a vision of the way in which God's bringing things to pass. The first thing is judgment comes with that kind of text. If that's what God purposes for Zion, the center of the earth, there's a whole great mythology, of course, that attaches itself to this Jerusalem, a former Canaanite town that was taken over by David and now becomes, in the mythology of the time, the center of the earth. It's called, Zion in the far north, which is clear indication that they're using analogies from West Semitic religion that has this as the mountain that reaches into the heavens, where earth and heaven are joined. So this Zion now is the place to which the nations come to find their own new life in God, and it's intended that that Zion begin to look like the city where justice and peace and righteousness prevail. If it's just a picture of some day to come chronologically, that would be fine, but that's almost certainly not the full or even the chief point of the thing. This is a description of the way God will have the world be. And if God wants the world to be that way, then that means, as I say, first off, judgment. Judgment on our towns, judgment on our communities, that they so little resemble this archetypal town. This Zion, which is a metaphor for an authentic, wholesome, human community. But the second thing that such things do is to give some hope, to give some confidence that that really is something on the way to happening. Now that's an act of faith, of course. That means you dig deep down in your resources of faith and put the question to yourself, do you really believe that this process is underway? Are you able to accept this as an affirmation of the tradition that's credible because it's God who is said to be at work to bring this about? If so, then you get a kind of last-ditch confidence in the meaningfulness of things, even when things seem so often not to be meaningful at all. Judgment, confidence. Maybe more important than those two is the way such visions operate to pull you forward toward their realization. There's a kind of dynamism that's set in motion when texts like this one are taken seriously, and you have in your inward being the confidence that God is bringing such a thing about, then it's not adequate for you not to be working toward the realization of the particulars of such a vision. This, I think, is the dynamism of much biblical ethics, and it has been much, much too little pressed upon us that these prophetic eschatological texts provide the dynamism for the moral life that we as Jews and Christians and as responsible citizens touched somehow by this biblical heritage seek to affirm. It's a drawing power. It's the kind of thing that certainly in Marxist life was a great drawing power for a long time, for Marxists, for socialists. This is the way it's got to be. It's the thing that keeps Fidel Castro in power, I'm sure. That Fidel, for many people, is still able to be the emblem of a process underway that is inevitable because the economic realities require that it happen. And the day is going to come. Now, of course, reality gets in your way. and makes it awfully hard sometimes for such things to be affirmed. But when they are a part of a vital religious understanding of the way things are leaning, then they have power. And fourthly, such texts also give something of what they promise. This kind of an affirmation of the way things will be is an affirmation that grows out of the actual experience of people. So any kind of eschatology partakes of realization. We know that. Mystics, of course, know it better than most of us, but all of us can know it to some degree. A text like that, then, rightly has been understood in Judaism and Christianity as a text that's describing an inner reality that's on the way to becoming outward. And there, I wouldn't fault the Christian community in the slightest for its spiritualizing, as we say, of such a text, so long as it doesn't merely spiritualize it. So long as it recognizes that this is a text about the real world. This is a text about this empirical world. It's not a text about going off to heaven. It's a text about the transformation of life on earth. So 4 points that I think are particularly important. Now let me quickly say a word about the other text and stop, give my good colleagues opportunity to respond. By the way, they didn't get to see any of all this, so they're sitting just as you are, and they're going to have to scratch their heads to come up with some critical word that they can say, and I have great confidence in their being able to do so. The other text is from Isaiah 35, and it's the one I think we didn't translate very well, Reginald. I think this is Reginald Fuller who worked on that translation all those years.
I was New Testament.
You were on the New Testament side. So you're not the blame of it, as a friend of mine used to say. You're not the blame of it. The text, as we all know from the great Brahms music and from many sources, it reads this way: the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, the desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it shall blossom. And there the poet makes a shift. The it is still talking about the desert, but it's also desert Zion. Desert, Zion lying desolate, its people scattered. It, the desert and desert Zion shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. God will come with vindication, with terrible recompense. God will come and save you. And then this text. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For water shall break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. See how the poet goes back to the image of the natural world. But all the time, what's being talked about is the new life, the new vitality in this Zion. And that's made clear by this closing word, this verse 8, the next closing section. A highway shall be there, a way. It shall be called the Holy Way. And this is the line we didn't translate very well, I think. The unclean shall not travel on it. Now that's the way translators have done it through the years. The word is avar, which certainly means to pass along, to travel. But there are texts not far away in the book of Isaiah, at least one, in which this verb does mean sort of pass by, make a mistake, slip, miss. And I think that must be its meaning here. The unclean shall not pass it by. That means even the unclean, perhaps referring to what they call lepers in the ancient world. The unclean shall not pass it by. It shall be for them. No traveler, not even the simple-minded, will lose their way. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come up on it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Now, if that were just a sentimental picture of the way a poet thought someday God had spiritually to bring all this about, that would be fine still. But if that's a text like the one from Isaiah 2, that's describing now the way the world's got to be, the way Zions the world over have got to be, then you see how it augments that other text. Because here what's being talked about is all that body of human life that fails to find realization of the purposed life God has in view for it. The weak, the feeble, those who are faint-hearted, given encouragement, the lame, the blind, the deaf, the ones unable to speak, the leper, the simple-minded, all those who never have a chance in life. And God knows we're presented every day, aren't we, with the millions of people who never, in that sense, have a chance in life. This is a text affirming that in God's purpose they have a chance. And that means that we, who take seriously that purpose of God, have an obligation to do what we can precisely for those who don't have a chance in life. Now, that is so much in the spirit of prophetic religion. It is so much the message of Jesus. It is so strongly an affirmation of what's in those ethical admonitions of Christian texts. And it is so prominent in the history of Judaism and Christianity that we have to say people have got that message, even with the missed translation. But with the, with the translation having the unclean not allowed in, you get a kind of spoiling of the image, I think. And that spoiling also appears in the book of Revelation, where this same Zion, transformed at the last day, mustn't have in it any unclean. And the New Testament apocalypse spells out what that means, Fornicators and idolaters and all kinds of nasty people are to have nothing whatever to do with that great city. Whereas the text that is its origin is saying, even those that the world gives up on, God does not give up on. So you see, what I think then we can say is that these Christian misreadings, which, by the way, are much less common today than they were when I began my work. They're much less common, and that's because Jews and Christians have spent so much time working on the church school literature, working on the question how to teach in the theological schools, working on the question how to make public pronouncements in the name of our church bodies, and also living and working together on common projects as we are in this particular setting, that we know one another better, and we do not let these ideologies govern our lives nearly to the extent that they once did. But the problem is, of course, these miserable things keep creeping back in, and one needs to be vigilant. Well, I think one of the great ways to be vigilant is to sort of concentrate for a bit on these prophetic texts that talk about the future and see if there isn't a lot more there that enables us to make genuine and positive and authentic common cause among Jews and Christians, and we have every right to say Muslims as well. For Islam has a big stake in this material of which we are speaking. Thank you very much.
I know we have all found this stimulating, and I thank Walter very much for this excellent presentation. Now, what I would like to do at this point, let's go alphabetic here. Larry Schlessinger first, and then Bob Trache, and then Walter, if you wish to make response to any of the comments, and then if you will just take the questions that the people have.
Okay, this is called Think Fast, I'll tell you that. First of all, I want to be the first, Dr. Harrelson, to thank you for coming all this way and to sharing really what's just a part of your wisdom with all of us. It's amazing what this gentleman has accomplished in his career and the projects he has going right now, yet to accomplish. So we thank you being here. I also want to thank Marcus and Carol and Gilbert and Fanny and Frank and the university and its president for hosting this each and every year and for inviting me to speak to you at this time. Dr. Harrelson made the initial statement that the Hebrew Scriptures contain outrageously wrong statements, and I agree with you that in part they do, and I would go even further step. And I would say that the ancient Israelite faith in many ways was outrageous. It was not outrageous in the sense that there is one God who created us all. It was not outrageous in the sense that we were to live moral and ethical lives. I mean, that we all agree with. It was outrageous in the way it portrayed that the world and God operated. Now, by that I mean, and stated in its simplest sense, the ancient Israelites believed that if we were good little boys and girls, or men or women, God would reward us. And if we were bad little boys and girls, or men and women, God would punish us. Therefore, if we were being punished, or it appeared we were being punished, then it must be that we did something wrong. And all we have to do to get things right again is to get right with God. And therefore, any famine that might have come was God's doing. Therefore, any of the superpowers of the time, meaning the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, although the Persians were regarded as good, the Greeks, and finally the Romans, and we're talking about 750 years of domination by a foreign power, these were interpreted as being God's instruments. God is punishing us for not being right with Him. Now, one of the jokes that was going around our neighborhood was God actually aiming for St. James, or did he just miss by a couple of doors? Well, I think we all know that God really had nothing to do with that lightning strike. Nature ran its course in its natural way, and St. James just happened to be in the way last summer. And I can tell you that as a child growing up in Washington, D.C., our house was hit by lightning. We were fortunate because it was raining at the time, and it put out the fire. All we had left was smoke. I could be the greatest tzaddik in the world, the greatest righteous person in the world, lived a perfectly good life, and if I walked to the top of the Empire State Building and I took a step off, gravity would take over, I would fall, no matter how good I was, I would die. Bad things do happen to good people. And it took the ancient Israelites an awful long time to realize that their original philosophy just didn't work. Bad things didn't always happen to bad people. Bad things happen to good people in a lot of instances. And I would agree with you that it was in the exilic period and thereafter that the change in that theology began to occur. And it really, I guess, is expressed in Job perhaps best, which you say was in Judah during the exile. And it progresses from what was probably not being the most popular theology to being 500 years later or so, the dominant theology with the Pharisees, what we would call rabbinic Judaism, from which I believe that Jesus and the disciples really came. It's funny because I think for the Jewish community, the notion that Judaism has, lost its meaning is one that is foreign to us, because we view it constantly and continually through our history as actually bringing constant comfort and constant purpose in life to us all. It is hard for us to envision anybody, I think, really feeling that Judaism has completely lost its relevance in society today. I think its notions of a one and eternal God of time and space and of us all is something that is absolutely universal. And I think that the passages that you shared with us that have those universal implications, you're absolutely right. It's not for one group, it's not for another group, it's for us all, because we are truly one human family. I speak to a lot of church groups, and I'm going to conclude with this. They come to the temple, they want to learn about the Jewish people, the Jewish faith. I guess in the last couple of decades or so, many Christians are really beginning to understand that their roots are in the synagogue. That's where the gospel was first preached, as we read in the book of Acts. Jesus himself spent some time at the synagogue in Capernaum, we know from the New Testament. So I point out the ritual objects that are in our sanctuary, which are pretty much the same as the synagogues in Jesus' day, and they connect with that. And then what I tell them is, I think, a good part of your message, that when we talk about Judaism and Christianity, you can take a superficial look at the two religions and you can say, oh, these are two completely different things, different holidays, different Sabbath, different rituals. But when you get down to the message of both, you begin to realize that you're really not talking about apples and oranges. You're really talking about apples, maybe two different varieties of apples, but apples nonetheless. And we have much more in common with one another than we have that's really different. And I heard that in your words tonight, and I'm very appreciative of it. I just want to conclude by sharing a passage from Pirkei Avot, which is the sayings of the fathers. And you sort of gave me the opportunity to be critical.
Yes, right.
But Pirkei Avot says that you should sit at the feet of the wise and drink in their words with great thirst. And that's what I did here this evening. And I thank you for sharing them with us.
Well, thank you, Larry. And again, I want to add my word of thanks to Frank and to all of you who have made this evening possible, and to Dr. Harrelson especially for his excellent presentation and his interesting analysis of how Christians have misinterpreted Jewish scriptures. They say in the joke going around my congregation is that, this never would have happened if they never called a Yankee, But we know what it's like to be homeless, and we're actually living a little bit of this eschatology, I think, between our two congregations. And I know that St. James's is not just grateful for the charity and the real, should I say, Christian charity, but for the charity of Beth Ahava, the congregation, but also for the joy and the love that we are experiencing as two congregations together, kind of playing with each other and learning about things from each other. It's very hard to find questions to ask, I think, because we're dealing with a very liberal group. So I was trying to put on my more conservative Christian hat as I listened to think about what some people would ask and some people would say. And I have one set of kind of Christian conservative questions and one kind of more liberal comment. But let me start with God's judgment, because it strikes me that that's a very telling and important theme, and it's clearly true that I think both Christianity and Judaism recognizes that we live in an imperfect and a broken world. The question is, how did it get that way? And for Christians, at least for some Christians, one of the reasons it got that way was because of this awfully difficult to understand and hard doctrine called original sin, which Augustine kind of drew up and we have, as Christians, had to deal with ever since. So it's certainly true that Christians easily read the Hebrew Bible and say, oh, well, look, there's an example of how not to do it. And God got mad. But I mean, a lot of Christians are perfectly good ancient Israelites, because they believe that anything good that happens comes from God, and anything bad that happens, is because they did something wrong. And a lot of it revolves around that issue of judgment and original sin, I think. I agree with Larry very much. Well, I have to tell you that I think I became a Christian when I got a rabbi, because I learned about, I for the first time understood who Jesus was, and understood what the message of Christianity was when I finally began to understand Judaism. And I couldn't learn it just by being a Christian. So I think that it used to be that people were shocked in the Christian family when they said Jesus was a Jew. Now, should we say Jesus was a Pharisee? I mean, should we say that? Should we, the Pharisees and the scribes are such bad guys in the Christian scriptures. They're looked at as the preeminent bad guys. But that seems to me to be a difficult reading an illicit reading of the Christian scriptures, not taking the context. I mean, you said the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible says a lot of outrageous things. I would say the New Testament says a lot of outrageous things too, and that we need to own that. But I think the most interesting part of your presentation was the eschatological part, because it's something that I really hope for. Christians, I think most Jewish people do not know how much Christians depend on Judaism. And it's a kind of love-hate relationship, because Christians think, or have thought for a long time, that they ought to convert all the Jews in the world, but they don't really want to. Because if they do, then they don't have anybody who really knows who's really a people of the covenant. So Christians need their Jewish brothers and sisters, and that creates a great deal of ambivalence in the Christian mind. And I mean, we have eschatological sayings that have been, I believe, misinterpreted for years, like the one in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," and that means that the way, the truth, and the life is to make the whole world a Christian. I don't believe that that's what that's intended to say, but there are lots of Christians who do. So the question is it really possible to have a mutually joint eschatology in the real world, since so much of Christian eschatology, at least historically, has been based upon polite religious dialogue? But the dean of the seminary, which I just left for my churches, I mean, we had a long and dialogue with Jews and Christians. He and I always disagreed, but he believed that fundamentally, it's up to Christians to bring Jewish folk along into the Christian view of their eschatology. So I wonder about how that is. I mean, it seems to me like it's sort of like Jacob and Esau, and sometimes the Christians are the usurpers here, and you have two brother or sister visions of the same religion, and how do we deal with that? And then I have one final question, which is not directed just at you, but all of you, and that is, in reading the Hebrew scriptures or in reading the Christian scriptures, which Christians and Jewish folk hold are revelatory to some sense, how does God then continue that revelation? Is it locked in those scriptures, or does the Spirit of God continue in revelation so that we can say, as you did, well, there are outrageous things in these books and we can ignore them? I mean, that seems to me to be a very difficult argument in both communities. In the Pirkei Avot that you, Larry, talked about, there's one little passage, one of the few passages about the Messiah in there, and there's this great dialogue between God and the Messiah. I don't know if you've ever read this, but it's a dialogue in which God says, well, to the Messiah, you're going to endure great suffering, and the Messiah says, well, I'll do it if you save all the people that you created, and or you save all the people who committed sin. And the dialogue goes on, then you'll save all the people you created. And then there's a great line in there. He says, I will do it if you save all the people you ever thought about creating. And that strikes me as the preeminent eschatological model. So those are my questions. What do we do with evil? How do we deal with mutuality and eschatology? Can we really do it? And where does Revelation continue?
Thanks very much. Well, I will take just a few moments to respond to these very important words, and I think I'll start in reverse order, so I won't forget the three, if I can remember them all. I think it's good to think about the first human sin in chapter 3 as having at least two dimensions. Suppose the man and the woman in the garden are seeking to fulfill their obligations in the garden. And it does look as though the woman's comments show this to be the case. And the snake's prompting the decision suggests another dimension. The woman sees this is a tree with fruit that's good to eat. And it's beautiful to the eye. A moral argument, an aesthetic argument, and a promise of learning, a promise of fresh understanding, a promise of coming to terms with life. So there's a woman who takes just a little bit, and the man who's with her all the time, and takes some. Makes it clear this is an act of the first human pair and not of the woman. And I think that so we can read that story as something about the appearance of evil in the world. Evil is prompted by something outside the self, but evil also arises within the self. That's what's being affirmed. And what the church people should have meant, if they did by original sin, was that these acts get embedded in the social structure. They don't just happen in the lives of individuals and then get forgotten, but they become a part of the texture of the common life. So that's original sin. That is, whenever human life appears, the sheer understanding of one's having been created in the divine image and sharing a life with God prompts one to excess or to defect, or more likely both. You're not required to sin, but as my teacher Ronald Niebuhr would say, sin's not necessary, it's only inevitable. And so I think that's part of it. And I think, Larry, that one could say about this heritage of our forebears, that if people do well, then they prosper, and if they do ill, they fail to prosper, is contravened by some of the great narrative literature within which that view is itself expressed. Now, I like the example from the book of Exodus about God's hardening the heart of Pharaoh. There are 3 sets of texts there. Some say just what I said. God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Got an active sentence. Others say Pharaoh hardened his own heart, kind of reflexive thing. And the third set says Pharaoh's heart got hard. It got hard. Nobody knows why in the world Pharaoh's heart got hard. But it did. Now you see, there's the picture, I think, of a kind of prompting from without. God intervenes, kind of rising up from within. And the third, kind of mystery of things. It reminds me of Joseph Heller's great novel, Something Happened. That's a great title. I don't think the book lives up to the title, but it's a great title. You know, things happen. And even some of the earthquakes just happen. They're not sent by God. See, and so that these texts transcend that flat ideology that does, of course, have to be rejected. It's one of the things we have to say also when radical feminists say that book is so bad we better just lay it aside and forget it, because it has a lot of stuff in support of a feminist understanding. A lot of support. So, original sin. How to get the eschatologists together? Well, I think the line I was trying to pursue does do that, or at least bids fair to do that. And then what we can say, I think, on the conservative side is, this does not preclude the claim of Christians that already in the life of the Christian community, realization is happening in a very distinctive way in the life, the ongoing life of the Holy Trinity. See, that this is now something that finds its realization there, but that does not mean that we are not also required to be claiming this heritage as that which empowers us to active moral pursuit of a better world. And I think Jewish mystics have got every right to talk about the way by which meditation on the Torah claims their lives, and about how the Sabbath is itself a kind of fundamental reality. Some will talk about the Torah as never having been created, but having really shared a life with God in eternity. And Jewish Ethiopians have in their tradition an understanding of the Sabbath in just those very terms. The Sabbath is eternal. It wasn't created on the seventh day, but the Sabbath has always been there. So that there are those kinds of realities that are part of the life that the Jewish community lives along with the Christian community that do fill out the distinctive, special features of the two communities. But I think that the making of common cause on those 3 points I made anyway, that this picture is a picture that brings judgment, that engenders hope and possible confidence in God, which we can't be complacent or blasé about, and also provides a lure that beckons us forward, are really as close to a common eschatology as we can get. Now, if it's possible then to get out of the sort of affirmation that these New Testament eschatological affirmations are the only ones that really count for us Christians, we can do what I've been describing. But we do have to find a way to do that. And I certainly don't want the distinctive Christian eschatological element simply discounted in favor of the others. But I just want a place to be found within the Christian community for such a reading of these. The last point, what was the last point?
Oh, Revelation. How
Yeah.
do you
Oh, yes, thanks. Well, the fact that we have a Bible that we call canonical is both providential and accidental. You get a bushel barrel full of scripture about all you can say grace over and you stop. See, that's, I think, one of the ways to see the canon. You just haven't got room for everything. And so you prune down at certain times. Until there's a problem, you don't prune down. But pruning down is essential and comes about. But that doesn't mean that then you can't any longer, that Jews can't look at the apocryphal literature. That Jews dare not study Enoch because Enoch is not a part of Tanakh. That's not the way it works. And then the question is, does the explosive religious reality lie only in those books? Or does it also appear outside those? And I think the answer is clearly, it appears outside. But then that doesn't mean that it doesn't appear inside. And for many people, the only thing that's interesting is the new. Well, to my mind, the reclaiming of that old heritage is the most novel and exciting thing that one can imagine. And I must say, I have a hard time as an individual knowing whether I'm living in the ancient biblical world or in the contemporary one. Because I don't know which is the more important, which claims to my life the more. It seems to me that what we do is move back and forth between and among these worlds. Well, we've talked enough. What comments or questions have you? And I have instructions to try to repeat the question, so don't ask too long questions, please. Yes, Bob?
Walter, I assume one of your respondents suggested that you would also say that there are outrageous errors in the New Testament.
Yes.
Historical.
Yes.
When you talk about Christian goodwill in simply missing the point or dealing with Hebrew scriptures in a way that is not accurate given what we know about Hebrew scriptures, I'm just wondering whether there is not in the heart of that the fact that one of the most outrageous historical errors in the New Testament is the source of that misinterpretation, and that is the claim to the deity of Jesus, which, according to the way I read it, leads the Christian community then to have to distort the Hebrew tradition, and it also creates the need on the part of the Christian church to be offended by the failure of the Jewish community to accept a claim that, as I understand it, Jesus never made for himself. And so, is it possible that the faith that you talk about as in goodwill, simply missing the point, has to miss the point if it insists upon that one historical mythology? And I'm not trying to get you to agree with me. I'm just asking if that is a possibility.
Bob, I think that's certainly frequently said, and it is a very important thing to weigh. Is the claim of Jesus as God that the church comes around to affirming, or is thought to have come around to affirming, in early classical Christianity, is said by many to mean that you simply cannot expect that Christians will not, therefore, make claims that on other grounds would seem to be excessive about the extent of the fulfilling of the divine work in Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, the second person of the Holy Trinity. Well, you see, Bob, I think we have so much to learn from the disputes and the debates in the early Christian community about those things that we haven't, as far as I can see, adequately learned, and we have so much fresh insight into the dimensions of, shall we say, plural thematic in the Jewish understanding of deity, that we ought now to really work at the question, what do we mean when we say that we are Trinitarian Christians? If what we're talking about is a unity in plurality, then we may end up, of course, with an understanding of the Trinity that's unsatisfactory to some Trinitarians. But it may be with that we can at least offer alternative understandings of that reality, and therefore the claim of the deity of Jesus. And I think that we'd be well advised to try to deflect the question, do you believe in the deity of Christ, into another question. Do I believe that in Christianity, in early Christianity, these Jewish perspectives on the unity in plurality of the Godhead were operative in such fashion as somehow or other to lead the Christian community, like elements within the Jewish community, to find a new way of talking about that unity in plurality, as it sought to describe its actual experience of the presence of God in the one called Jesus, whom this community declared to have been raised from the dead. Now, put in those terms, I think we don't have the option. I believe in the deity of Jesus. I don't believe in the deity of Jesus. Now, that just may be theological fudging of the issues, but I don't believe that it is. I think that what one can say is look at the figure of wisdom. In chapter 8, wisdom is still a creation of God, present with God at the creation, sharing the divine life, clapping its hands or her hands as wonderful new things are made. That's what one part of the text looks like. Or maybe, according to another reading of that word, amon, maybe sharing in the creation actively, but still as the first of the creatures. That text then, when it appears in Sirach chapter 24, is kind of the wisdom present at the creation as a sort of mist that goes out and touches everything that God has made. It's still a creation, but it's somehow partaking of the divine all the more. In the wisdom of Solomon, it's quite clear that this is now a reality that shares the divine life, and it pervades the totality of everything that's been made. So you get now an element out of classic philosophy of the Greek world that's sort of building upon that. In the Gospel of John, in the prologue, there's a transposition of that whole understanding of wisdom into the picture of the Word. And in Colossians in chapter 1, a yet further transformation, as I read it. And so what you're getting then is, you see, a kind of anchoring in this wisdom tradition of the one called Word. The one called Word. So Word and wisdom are now somehow polar realities in the development of the notion, how is God at one and the same time sovereign and Lord of all, directing the course of human affairs and the whole of the natural world, and also present with us, fully present with us, sharing our life with us, one with us? And how does that reality continue in the life of the Christian community? As genuinely divine presence, guiding us, groaning, seeking to make delivery of new things possible. Now, all of that, it seems to me, it gives us biblical imagery for the unpacking of what will be a later understanding of Jesus as third person of the Trinity. And it's so much better to talk that way than to talk of the deity of Christ. See, and that's, I think, one of the ways by which people short-circuit the actually complex way by which the notion of the sacred Trinity is being affirmed in early Christianity. Here, I'm not really an expert, but I think that at least we've got some ways by which to get people to work with us who think in those terms. Yes?
Would you agree? It seems to me that we've got to get away from the notion that the meaning of Scripture is fixed once for all by the intention of the original writers.
Yes.
And that faith communities
Yes.
can see new truths in it. And that means to say that the Jewish faith community can see truths in those same Scriptures in different ways from what we see.
Yes.
I think, for instance, Isaiah 53.
Yes.
We can't expect our Jewish brethren to say that speaks to us of Christ.
Yes.
But to us it does.
Of course it does.
So we've got to agree to...
Yeah. That's absolutely right, Professor Fuller. That, it's a living tradition. One of my slogans is to say, a tradition, by its nature, must be passed on by the religious community faithfully and intact. But the only way that it can be passed on intact is for it to enter so deeply into the world of a given time, the social, the economic, the political, the cultural world of a given time, that it undergoes transformation in order to be itself and to be passed on intact. So I know that's a kind of ironic way of putting it, but it is, I think, the way tradition gets passed on. And it does mean then that the faith community is a community under the Spirit, claiming this heritage and seeing things in it that prior generations did not see, and failing to see things in it that prior generations did in fact see. So that we're also in the process of seeing things and missing things. And then a next generation will see things that we have missed, as we have seen things that prior generations may have missed. And all of that has to do with the ongoing life of people. That is, think of what Phyllis Tribble has been able to point out about the term Adam in Genesis 2. Now, she may not be absolutely right, but it does seem to me that she is so close to right that you'll just have to say that's about it. I like to call that creation in Genesis 2 a humanoid. And say that this is not now a male until the tardema, the deep sleep, falls on this humanoid. And in the deep sleep, the operation takes place, and what you get now is a man and a woman engaging in poetic exchange. Now, we wouldn't have seen all of that if we hadn't been worried about some things, about, the man as created first, of course, the woman as the first sinner, and all of that. And I think that that's just an example that appears over and over again. And with regard to Torah, for example, Torah can be described in Psalm 119 as something the community genuinely loves. I love your Torah, God. It is the delight of my life. Now, if Christians read that and say, how in the world can you love commands to do this and that, then that's a failure to understand what Torah is. Torah is sort of the patterning of life that God in the divine graciousness has provided to human people. It's a way in which to live, a way in which to walk. And what a joy it is not to be deprived of that blessed gift. So reading Psalm 119 after conversation with Jews who know about this dimension of Torah, or having seen people rejoicing in Torah, it's one of the greatest of the gifts, I think, of Orthodox Judaism, that it can still celebrate Simchat Torah and help us to see, among lots of weird things, some glorious things. Because it's a sign now of the love and rejoicing in the fact that God has given us a way in which to walk. And you see, you can't say that the Apostle Paul in Romans and in Galatians is denying all reality to that meaning of Torah. For him, nomos may be somehow related to Torah, but it's certainly not, I think, equivalent to that understanding of Torah.
Gentlemen, I wonder if maybe we shouldn't at this point adjourn to our reception area and continue our conversation there. And Walter, again, let me say how much I appreciate the job that you did. You have simulated our thought processes, and we will continue to think about the things that you have said. And to both of our respondents, Larry and Bobby did a terrific job. Exactly what I would hope that you would do in terms of raising the questions and getting us started. Thank you so much. So let's adjourn to the back and we can continue the discussion there.